Hey, those of you who are entering and coming in, welcome to our webinar. And I'll let Martijn take over from here since many of you are more familiar with Martijn. Martijn, looking sharp with the nice beard. You got to turn on your audio though, so your audio isn't on yet.
Great.
Okay, now we can hear you. How's it going?
Pretty good. I'm getting ready for the retreat in Costa Rica, so I'm really excited to jump on that plane and meet some of you probably during the retreat. We're actually going to do microdosing there with San Pedro, so I'm really excited to do that in a more ceremonial setting. So, yeah.
Fantastic. And what's the sort of ceremonial setting that you're setting up, or do you want to keep that a secret? So that
no, I actually want to make people jealous. So it's already an open secret. So what we're going to do is we're going to prepare with yoga, meditation, and breath work. And then we have actually San Pedro Yukama. I don't know how you pronounce that. Shamans coming in, and they're going to sing and introduce the medicine. And then we're going to do I think a 4-hour hike into a waterfall. We're going to do another meditation. And after that, we do a sharing and a workshop. So it's like really optimizing the setting to experience this beautiful, beautiful substance.
And that's, I think, what we'll get into in the webinar today is we're going to talk a lot about how we can optimize our set and setting. So our mindset when we go into the experience, and then, the general environment that we're in for microdosing, because I think, as we've spoken about extensively, even though microdoses are much more subtle, even sub-perceptible compared to higher doses, the intention that we go into it with is still just as critical and important in the level of self-awareness and self-understanding that we come out of the experience with.
First of all, I really want to thank you for making the time and share your expertise. I know you've been really diving really deep in this subject matter, and I don't know anyone who knows as much about microdosing you do, and I know you've done many expert interviews recently for your course, and so I would love to hear more about what you've learned, what you experienced, how other people come to you and tell you like this works, this doesn't work. So could you maybe introduce yourself to people who might not know you yet?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time here, so just for our listeners as well who are coming in, make sure you go ahead and you introduce yourself in the chat box. So just say where you're from and just say a little bit about why you're here. And then after we get through the introduction, we're going to go ahead and dive right in to the actual substance of the interview. So Martijn, I appreciate you asking. Basically, my name, for those of you who don't know me, which is probably most of you. My name is Paul Austin. I'm the founder of a website called The Third Wave, which is about responsible, intentional, and structured use of psychedelic substances. Hey, Bill. And really the focus of our efforts have been on amplifying the conversation around microdosing because it is a much more approachable way to start engaging with psychedelic substances. So Martijn and I have been working on and off on this together to some degree for almost a year now. When I first spoke about microdosing publicly, Martijn was at that first event, and then that was in Amsterdam. And then about 5 months later, we went to a conference together where we spoke about microdosing and kind of creativity and innovation. So I'm really excited for this webinar today. I think we're going to get into some really interesting conversations. And I think it's also worth emphasizing that neither Martijn nor I come from a medical background. We're really interested in this concept of microdosing for maximizing human potential, for self-actualization, for the betterment of well-being. And that is by and large what we're going to focus on today in this interview. So that's a little bit about me. That's a little bit about kind of the story of what we're doing. And I'm really excited to be interviewed by Martijn, who's a good friend of mine and someone that I respect incredibly. And I'm excited to blow your mind a little bit.
Yeah, so me and Paul have been working on a few projects together, and it's been really fascinating to meet other entrepreneurs in this space. We really want to take the lead on this cultural tool, this innovation, and really further the cultural narrative. People can actually use these tools to, like you said, to increase their self-awareness, compassion, and well-being. So maybe it's helpful to share a little bit, like, why did you start with microdosing? Why?
What got me into microdosing, right? Like what?
Yeah, what got you? Like, why did you keep doing it, and why did you feel like the need to actually create a portal on this website around it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and so I think, and Martijn, just so you know, people might. Michael says Martijn is great at keeping it incredibly still. It's because your video is a little bit frozen. So really? At the top you can reduce the quality, so it's not HD, but it's low definition LD, and that will make it easier so that your bandwidth is there. There you go, perfect. That's good. And then you probably should turn your audio back on as well. All these little things. So
thanks for helping me.
Absolutely. When a friend in need is a friend indeed. So how did I get into psychedelics? I mean, I think like many of probably the attendees here, I was raised on a steady diet of propaganda and bullshit, with the drug war growing up around cannabis, and then particularly psychedelics. And I smoked cannabis for the first time when I was 16. And in some ways it was for me a gateway drug, but not in the typical way, more in the consciousness expanding way, the ability to understand new perspectives and new realities through an altered state. And so when I was 19, I dropped acid for the first time and had fucking profound, beautiful, amazing experiences. And in a very similar sort of setting and location as we recently did these synthesis retreats in Amsterdam, Martijn. It's funny that you had mentioned, you grew up tripping for the first time in a similar place geographically, and I grew up tripping in actually a similar place, from the dunes and the water and whatnot as well. And after I had these really profound experiences, I noticed that I was more focused on my academic work at the time. That was easier for me to stay disciplined with the food that I ate and the exercise that I did, that I was more engaged and present emotionally in relationships. And it was really easy to kickstart new habits like meditation or yoga, because I had that open window of plasticity. And so when I heard about microdosing, I was living in Thailand at the time, in Chiang Mai, doing the whole digital nomad thing, building my first business, which was in teaching English. And I heard about microdosing, and I thought back, oh, wait, I had these beautiful experiences about 5-6 years ago, this beautiful afterglow effect. I wonder if microdosing can help to keep open that window of plasticity so that it becomes easier generally to eat healthy, to be emotionally engaged in relationships, to start new habits. And so I started microdosing in June 2015. And this was about 3 years ago. And it was a couple years after you wrote your first article on high existence, which actually was kind of the go-to resource at that time. And then, and of course, I tell you all the time, like Martijn is really the foundation of this whole microdosing thing, because without him, none of this other stuff would have been possible. So
I stole it from other people, so sure. we're all sharing, I guess.
We can say Jim Fadiman is kind of the starter.
Yeah, Jim. Actually, Albert Hoffman, he was actually doing it for the first time, trying it in low doses, and then sharing that with his inner circle. And that came out, and I think Jim, he got word of that, tried it, liked it, shared it, and then he mentioned it in the book where I got it from. And then I found all these other sources like, hey, people are doing actually extreme sports on psychedelic. And I've heard crazy stories, like a friend of mine, he loves like freestyle climbing on acid. And whenever, like way before, I'd never done a psychedelic, I thought that guy was out of his mind. But now, having climbed myself on a psychedelic, not too high of a dose, but significant microdose, I can see how it improves like everything. So
absolutely, and I'm glad you brought up Albert Hoffman, who, as many of us may know, is the inventor of LSD. And in a High Times magazine interview in like the 70s, he thought, he mentioned publicly that he thought it could be a useful replacement for ADD and ADHD medications. And I think they're going through now the first clinical, and this is kind of like secret, but they're going to start the first clinical trials in Canada in the next year or so to test microdosing
Really?
as a potential replacement for ADD and ADHD medications.
That's awesome. So that was also mentioned in the Netflix, the Netflix documentary where James featured. That's awesome, man. I'm
Take Your
really
Pills, right? The one that we wrote
pills,
on High Existence that was recently published. And that was great. So, but kind of back to the question, just so I can wrap this up, so we can continue into the next questions, because this will transition. The two main reasons that I was interested in microdosing was to help with social anxiety. So I'm someone who tends to be more introverted. And when I go out in large social situations, I would struggle. I would be in my head a lot and kind of like overthink things. And microdosing just helped me to get back into my body and be totally present in the situation that I was in. And then the second thing that it really helped with was flow states. So this concept of flow is this concept of being in the zone. And when you're working on a project that's maybe a little bit more difficult than you're used to, you can enter a flow state and be completely immersed. And so I had heard about microdosing potentially helping with this, and I tried it. It was really helpful with that sense of flow, particularly on creative projects when I was building a business for the first time. So the reason that I started this portal, right, this platform for microdosing, is because from my honest perspective, I believe that psychedelics as a tool for self-awareness, self-understanding, just general, development and maturation. We know of all these other tools like meditation, yoga, breath work, these things that help to cultivate presence in non-dual states. But because of cultural stigma, psychedelics are locked away in a toolbox with a bunch of dust on them. And so I thought, with the kind of the ecological disaster that we're going through, these tools hold tremendous potential if used responsibly, intentionally, in a structured setting to catalyze deeper levels of self-awareness, so that we come to this understanding that we are not existing within this isolated bubble, but that as whatever, an energy source, or as, an individual, we do exist in a larger community of beings. And so I thought this is a really important mission and topic. And the main, of course, issue is psychedelic literacy. It's psychedelic education. We have now the clinical research that's coming out, but still a lot of people just aren't well informed about these substances.
That's actually what I love about you, or I love telling the story that before you went on stage at the Next Web, you gave this big speech. It's now on YouTube. It's doing really well. I think it's 100,000 views almost. And you went on stage there and you admitted, I took acid today.
Right. And I find that to be such a beautiful way to strip off the stigma of these substances. Is we have to embody, and we have to be transparent and open about what we're doing. And if you step up on stage and you embody certain characteristics, not even what's coming out of your mouth, but how you look, how you act, how you come across, and you admit to doing acid, all of a sudden, in an individual's mind, it goes from, oh, acid is something of the counterculture that hippies and dropouts do, to wait, this is something that could be a useful tool for people who are interested in accelerating development, understanding, awareness, et cetera, which of course is the focus of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's actually legit. And I think that coming out is like really important. Like I remember, I think before I published my first psychedelic article, it wasn't microdosing, I think it was about ayahuasca. I was actually wondering, do I want to put this under my real name and coming out? And I spoke with Rick Doblin before, and he said one of the most important things is to spread the word, in the sense that, yes, I'm normal and I'm still taking psychedelics for these and these reasons. And I think that's so important to further this cultural movement. What do you find are the most common reasons why people use psychedelic microdosing? And what are the outcomes if you do follow this intentional, structured protocol?
That's a great question. So what are the reasons people get into this, and then what are the outcomes? So really, I try to break it down into two main reasons. I'll go into some of the auxiliary reasons as well. The two main reasons are for the betterment of well-being. So self-actualization, self-awareness. And those are people who are interested in microdosing for creativity, for flow states, for just, they're already, things are pretty good. They have the typical ups and downs of life, but they don't have clinical depression or really, or addiction or alcoholism. Things are pretty good. but they want to explore new boundaries and new areas. They want to really elevate their existence. And that is kind of the demographic that a lot of people talk about with microdosing in like the Silicon Valley types. And of course, that was kind of the first wave of microdosing. And then the second wave was after Ayelet Waldman published a really good book called A Really Good Day, How Microdosing Made a Mega Difference in My Mood, My Marriage, and My Life, where she used microdosing to help with suicidal ideation, depression, bipolar disorder. And so after that book came out, a lot of people became interested in microdosing to help with clinical issues, depression, addiction, anxiety, things like this. And so, we'll talk about that, Mike, for sure, legality and availability. And so those are the two main groups of people. And so what people notice when they microdose is generally there's an elevated mood. Because psychedelics are an antidepressant, because they activate the 5-HT2A receptor, which we won't get too into, but it's one of 14 serotonin receptors. There's an elevated mood when people start microdosing, which is thus responsible for its antidepressant effect, and also then responsible for its, enhanced creativity and flow state effect. And then the other kind of benefits that people are reporting from microdosing is they're reporting a stronger sense of presence. So, a lot of times what causes us issues is, we focus on the past, which is what is rumination, which is tied to depression. We're focused on the future, which is tied to anxiety. Like meditation, mindfulness meditation, microdosing can help to facilitate that sense of presence, the sense of being here now. And I think that happens, and this is just speculative, but I think that happens because of an increase in serotonin, which is directly tied to heightened levels of contentment. And when we're content, we're more likely to be present and grateful for what kind of is unfolding before us and what might seem indicated in the future, depending on what we're doing.
Yeah, I think it also has to do with the reducement of activity in the default mode network, which constantly tries to control everything and be at the lookout of causes that might cause of anxiety, cause of depression. And if you're already okay in your, like you said, in your presence, you don't need to look for external circumstances to give you this sense of feeling good. So this is the question we often get, and I would love to hear your answer again. Isn't this just another drug? Isn't this just like Adderall, Xanax, SSRIs, Prozac, all that you take and then you get addicted or you get emotionally dependent on it, etc.?
Right. So, and this is actually coming up in the chat box right now, which I think is really interesting and good timing. Talking about this. And I'm going to kind of come at it from two perspectives. I'm reading this book right now by Tao Lin, which I'm going to write in. It's called...
it just came out, I think, right?
Trip. Yeah.
Trip,
about
yes.
It's like psychedelics, alienation, and change or something. And in that book, he talks a lot about how, in his mind, after he did psychedelics, he thought of psychedelics and he thought of drugs. In other words, a lot of the drugs that we use, which are things like, if we talk about maybe the harder drugs, opiates, coke, amphetamines, methamphetamines, some of these things that are stimulants, but also opiates are kind of like, downers. Those largely are active on the dopamine system, the dopaminergic system. They cause addictive behavior, whereas psychedelics are largely active on the serotonergic system, so they're not near as addictive. So, and that's partly why they're termed as medicine in many indigenous societies, because they're used to help this process of spiritual cleansing in many ways. And so I think that's one way to look at it, is psychedelics are not really similar to any other sort of drugs that we know. They act on the brain in a much, much different way. But I think the second, point to make, which is the psychological dependence, which I think is a very relevant point and a very important point and a valid criticism of the microdosing phenomena, is, well, clearly microdosing has these effects. Don't we become psychologically dependent then on these substances if we want to increase creativity or do whatever else it might be, improve spiritual development. What's that level of dependence? And I think this is when we get into this conversation of attachment, dependence versus conscious relationship. And I think having a conscious relationship with these substances is extremely important. And I think part of having a conscious relationship is, one, understanding that microdosing is a tool, but it's not necessarily the tool, and that a lot of people will benefit much more from just cleaning up their diet, exercising 3 to 4 times a week, getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night in a dark room, meditating, right? These are other habits of self-care that are really important. And what microdosing can do is it can initiate or activate us to kind of get out of the rut, to start integrating these positive habits, because we have that open window of plasticity. But this is worth emphasizing. It shouldn't just be microdosing. If you're microdosing, you really should look at combining it with other modalities like meditation, breath work, float tanks. There are many other things that we can use that cultivate those states of presence and non-dual awareness, so that when we decide, hey, I microdosed for, let's say, 2 months, because most people who start microdosing, they'll microdose from 2 to 3 to 4 months, maybe about twice a week. So, okay, let's take a month off. Let's take 2 months off. I do this with coffee often. I'll take a couple weeks off just to set back to baseline, to understand, okay, this is where I'm at now, and then to build from there. So I think that those are the two kind of angles that I take. Psychedelics are not really like other drugs, and it's not just about the psychedelic. It's about cultivating these states of presence, and that can be done with breath work, meditation. Microdosing is often just a way to kickstart that open window to make it easier to develop and integrate really solid habits.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. For me, microdosing makes me more aware of the causes that actually increase my anxiety and depression. And because I'm getting more self-awareness, it's easier for me to make the right decisions, because I know not making those right decisions, I'm going to end up in a place where I don't want to be. And that awareness really helps. And another thing that really makes me not worried for myself to get dependent on a microdose is that it's not always comfortable. It's not always easy. It's like you realizing things about yourself that might not be as pretty or as helpful, and really just in your face, like, you have to change this, you have to improve on this. And then after a while you get the message, you don't want to hear the message anymore, you just want to get it fixed. And so in the beginning, when I did a protocol twice a week, sometimes it was even hard for me to keep doing it, because in the short run, it wasn't always really pleasant, even though I had really nice experiences. So
right. And that's such an important part to bring up. I was actually just reading Carl Jung this morning. What's the book? It's about the individual self, the role of the individual self. I actually saw it as a book recommendation on high existence. And, what Carl Jung was known partly for was, talking about the shadow side. And oftentimes we don't face our unconscious because it is so intimidating, and there are so many kind of dirty little things in there. And microdosing, often opens that box, like higher doses of psychedelics do. And to integrate that, to understand it, we need to make sure that we give ourselves the proper space and time to work with it. And that it's not just about this kind of hedonistic, I want everything to be beautiful and bright, but really it's about doing the work. And sometimes the work is difficult. And it comes with confronting certain aspects of ourselves that we'd rather not face.
Yeah, really good at. There's a question by John that I really like. Do the positive effects from microdosing last only during the period you're reducing, or do those transformations become something like a long-term trait?
And this
lasts long-term.
Yeah, and this is a phenomenal follow-up question even to what we were just talking about, because if we open that window of plasticity when we're microdosing, then if we continue to use that window of plasticity to integrate habits, to go through them again and again, and they become ingrained. We basically create new neuronal connections in our brains where it becomes then easier to do those habits, even if we're not microdosing. But I would say that it's still after you're done microdosing, for example, if you want to maintain this sense of presence, the sense of increased creativity, flow, improved emotional engagement, you still need to be very persistent on pursuing a high degree of self-care. So even if you stop microdosing, meditation is still really important. Eating well is important. Sleep is really important, because microdosing is just a tool to start to access these states, but to really integrate those long-term, you need to be proactive about continuing to cultivate that sense of awareness, even if it's not through microdosing. And so that's really important to keep in mind, because if you microdose, you start to build all these great habits. You're eating well, you're sleeping, you're exercising, your relationships are improving, and then you stop microdosing. But then you also stop meditating. You start going out late and partying. You don't sleep as much anymore. Your diet gets worse. You're just going to fall back into the same thing that you were before. So really look at microdosing as an opportunity to optimize, and then look at how we can utilize other modalities over the long term to maintain that sense of optimization.
Right. So those people who say microdosing is just a fad, what would you tell them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So microdosing, a fad. I think there's an element of that might be true, in that we're really seeing like a lot of media coverage right now. We're really seeing a heightened interest in the topic of microdosing because it's so surprising. LSD, a Schedule I drug. People are taking it in low amounts to do X, Y, and Z. That's very, incendiary for many people. So I think there's an element of, it's definitely peaking right now and it will level off. But I think it's not going to be a fad in that it peaks now and then people just don't do it anymore. I think we're discovering so much about psychedelics through research in particular, that the interest in psychedelics is only going to continue to increase in popularity. Now that cannabis is becoming legalized and legitimized, cannabis in many ways is a gateway drug to open up us to state-sanctioned, altered states of consciousness that are not caffeine, nicotine, or alcohol. Now we're throwing cannabis in the mix. And with medical research, all the medical research that's coming out around psychedelics, and as I mentioned before, Michael Pollan, who wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma, a really well-known journalist, and wrote this really good piece in The New Yorker called The Trip Treatment. His book comes out in about 10 days on psychedelics. And so the cultural interest, now that we have that bedrock of research on psychedelics, I think the cultural interest is just going to continue to grow as more and more people recognize the need to understand themselves on a deeper level. And I think that is really what we're transitioning into. I mean, Nietzsche spoke about this with the sense that God is dead. These morals, these ways of perspectives that we look at in the world or with the world, those are going to be more and more cultivated on an individual basis rather than having and giving up our identity as part of a larger kind of state-sanctioned approval. And I think microdosing in the psychedelic process, because they act as those initiators to amplify how we're already feeling, I think these are going to be some of the most, if not the most incredible tools that we have to really understand ourselves so that people can live their best lives, whatever that might be for the individual. And Martine is frozen. Martine, are you still here? Martine? Okay. So Martine, it looks like he took off. No, he'll be back. I'm sure he just had a problem with his internet connection. I'm still going to be here. What I'd like to do is just take a brief break. And I'd like to ask both all of you a couple questions just so that we have an understanding of why you're here. So the first one that I'd love to know is, have you tried microdosing before? We haven't had a chance to do these polls yet. And so I'd love to see from a response perspective, how many of you have tried microdosing and how many of you have not. So we have about 20% of you who said, yes, you've tried microdosing before, 25. Now we're seeing about 75% of you said no. So about 1 in 4 of you have tried microdosing and 3 in 4 of you have not, which is really interesting. And I'm glad that we're then doing this webinar so more and more of you can get the education that you need around microdosing. Let's do a second poll while we're at it. For the second poll, let's go ahead. Hold on, I'm going to reset the poll. I'd love to know, why are you interested in microdosing? So what brought you here to this webinar today in terms of your personal interest? Is it for creativity and focus, kind of amplifying your overall state of well-being? Is it as an aid to help with spiritual development? Is it to help with depression, addiction, anxiety, some sort of, maybe clinical issue, or just, things aren't going well and you'd like a little bit of a pick-me-up? Is it to enhance physical performance, or are you just curious? Maybe you're just curious. Okay, so some of you for enhancing physical performance. And so, great. So creativity and focus, spiritual help with depression. So about between those three, it's generally even. And so I think this is a really important aspect of microdosing, particularly as we need to use it to help accelerate self-awareness, is what is your intention in microdosing? And that is really important to consider and think about at length before you start a microdosing protocol. Just like with high doses of psychedelics, the intention that we go into the experience with will then dictate, by and large, how our experience unfolds. But unlike high doses of psychedelics, microdosing happens over a longer time frame. So to get the sort of help that you need, really spend a lot of time thinking and reflecting on, what's my intention in going into this experience? What do I want to get out of it? And how can you then optimize your experience? And this is something that we talk a lot about in our microdosing course, which we'll discuss at the end of the webinar, is this optimization process. Because microdosing comes with a lot of legal risks, as we talked about before, a lot of people are going out on a limb to make this happen. And if you're going to put yourself in that sort of risky situation, you want to make sure you get, quote unquote, the most out of it. You want to make sure that it is a meaningful, impactful, profound experience, because it does have that potential. But so many people lose out on that because they just don't really pay attention to the finer details. They just see microdosing as this thing where, you take a little bit of a psychedelic once or twice a week and you see what happens. That's like going into a meditation habit and being like, I'm just going to sit on my floor for 10 minutes every morning and see what happens. And you're probably not going to get a lot out of it. You really need to make a focused, intentional effort to cultivate and optimize your own experience. So now Martijn looks like he's back. Martijn, can you hear us? You might have to turn on your microphone.
I can hear you. Sorry.
Okay.
It's okay. Yeah.
I was playing the entertainer. So we were really digging into things, and probably just keeping it with this video is fine if you feel like your connection isn't great, Martijn. So if you want to turn your video off, if you think that's easier or better for the connection, feel free to do that. I'll leave that up to you.
Thanks.
Yeah. So shall we dig back into some of the questions that you have?
Sure. My colleague John had an amazing one that I never asked you before. I would love to know your most memorable microdosing experience you've had.
And I think that is always kind of the first couple microdosing experiences, when you're first starting to work with this and you use it in a way that helps you to navigate a new situation. I think it can be beautiful. So it was, I think, the second or third time that I microdosed, actually, and this was with LSD, and it was with a good friend of ours, Nico, in Budapest. And I was there with Nico and another friend. And this was about, again, 3 years ago, right when I first started microdosing. And we woke up early and took a microdose and basically went into the high hills of Budapest in this park called Norma Fő, overlooking the Danube and the beautiful hills that surround Budapest. And basically, we just hiked through that park and had this amazing experience, which in turn, through microdosing, through the process of microdosing, we birthed the idea of the third wave. And so I think this, for me, has always been the most memorable experience, because it was through microdosing that we actually came up with this idea of this concept and this movement that we could start to build psychedelic legitimacy around. And the way that name kind of came to be is we were going, and this speaks to the divergent thinking processes that are so relevant when we're microdosing, is we were going to all these third wave coffee places in Budapest. So third wave coffee are those like fancy schmancy hipster places that you go where you get a nice little swan on your latte. Yeah, it's the ones that I go to because obviously I live in Bushwick in Brooklyn and I'm an uber hipster. Not really. But and so these are third wave coffee places, and it's the artisanal approach, you know, the really nice curated single origin approach. And so we were going to third wave coffee places, we were taking psychedelics, and then all of a sudden, boom, third wave of psychedelics. And I think this speaks to the process of what psychedelics can facilitate is taking two completely separate ideas, disparate ideas, coffee and psychedelics, and then combining them, synthesizing a new idea, which in this case was this concept of the third wave of psychedelics. I think for me, that was the most memorable experience that I was able to have. And then we've had a number of memorable experiences microdosing. I think another one would be speaking at the conferences that we've been to, both the one in Zurich this past year, which I microdosed 4-ACO-DMT, which is a psilocin analog. And then we had that beautiful view of the Alps when you walked out into the grass. And that was mesmerizing and gorgeous as well. So those are probably some of the best experiences.
Mm-hmm. So I agree, that was amazing, even though I didn't have a microdose. Like maybe it's easy for you because it's your job to come out and tell people about microdosing. But what do you say to people to, like, they want to try it, but they might fear any like social judgment or like the idea that they're taking a drug to get some form of enhancement? Like what do you suggest how to think about microdosing in that context?
Yeah, so I think the way that I've discovered this is easiest to talk about is by leading with cannabis. And so if you're in, like, even with, let's say, your family or a close group of friends or a larger group of friends, or you're at a party and just talking with someone, maybe the conversation comes up and you're like, oh yeah, I've been microdosing and I've noticed this and this. Or have you been reading these articles about microdosing? And someone might be like, aren't psychedelics like really illegal? Because that's usually the first kind of like, they're illegal, so they must be bad, right? That's the connotation that we have. So then I'd say, well, the psychedelics are kind of like cannabis in that they actually have all these medical values and they can really help with certain things. But because of misinformation and a lack of education, they're not well understood. And so I kind of go into then cannabis now is being legalized. I think in 8 states or 9 states it's now been legalized. In the United States, there's 30 to 35 states with medical cannabis. And so I say, look at what cannabis is doing. Mm-hmm. The medical marijuana came first, and now we're seeing legalization and legitimization. And then I specifically transition into research. And then I go, and you'll never believe it, there's all this research going on with psychedelics right now, like with MDMA for PTSD, psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety and depression, psilocybin for alcoholism, psilocybin for addiction. I mean, we could go on and on. But the point is, there are all these medical studies. And so the key is always education. Yeah. If you speak from a place of being informed and you base that information in science, empirical evidence, legitimate anecdotal reports, then people are going to listen. They're not going to just count you off. They're going to go, oh, there might be something to this. And then if they have more questions, you send them the TRIP treatment, the article by Michael Pollan in the New Yorker. Maybe you just send them Michael Pollan's new book. Maybe you send them a piece from another mainstream news publication that's talking about like psychedelics. And that's why we built the Third Wave as a psychedelic educational resource. And so I'd say, if you want to become better informed, just go to our website. We have obviously tons of resources. We've specifically created that as a brand with the aesthetic that it has. So if someone who comes there who has questions about psychedelics, who's skeptical, it looks professional. And so they'll start to engage with the topic as a result of that.
Great. There's a question here by Jota. I'm not sure if I pronounce your name correctly. I hope I do. He said, if you take a regular dose, can you start microdosing next week? I think this is a question about tolerance.
Yeah. So microdosing, like high doses, have short-term tolerance. So as long as you give yourself 2 to 3 days in between the high dose and the microdose, you should be okay. So just be aware of that, but there shouldn't be any interaction.
Yeah. To follow up on this, there's the question by John. Is there a significant difference in benefits between frequent microdosing and infrequent larger doses? So what's like, how do you use psychedelics in general? Like when do you use microdosing and when do you use higher doses, and what's the kind of the frequency in your life?
Yeah, and this is a great question, and we'll probably do this question, I would imagine, just so the audience knows. We'll do this question, we might do one more, and then we're gonna kind of wrap up. We'll do some Q&A and a few other things as well. So this relationship between microdoses and higher doses. From a basic perspective, I find microdoses to be helpful in accelerating the path of development once you have that compass set. So once you know, okay, you have a sense of strong internal confidence. You're like, okay, I know I want to pursue this. I know this is the path I'm on. I understand it's difficult. I understand it will come with obstacles, but I'm committed. And I found microdosing helps with the process of driving that path, of going along that path. What I found higher doses of psychedelics to be extremely effective for is paradigm shifts. So whether you don't have clarity on a specific problem or issue, or whether you're unclear about something, or whether just things aren't going all that well, you're looking for new perspective, new ideas. If your compass is going this way and you want to have a paradigm shift, then I find high doses of psychedelics can help with that. Now that comes with a higher level of risk as well, because that paradigm shift, as we were talking about earlier, that sense of facing your shadow side, your unconscious, is not always so pretty. And there's sometimes some deep issues and things that come up that need to be integrated and understood. So that's why if you're going to do a high dose, looking at that paradigm shift, highly, highly encouraged to pay close attention to set and setting, and make sure you have a friend, a therapist, an integration specialist, someone who, if you need to, you can speak to about your experience afterwards. Yeah. So I think that's kind of, for me, how I would break it down into those two avenues.
For those who do want to do a higher dose and have a specifically curated setting with a medical supervisor at hand, me and Paul started to do retreats here in the Netherlands where it's safe to do truffles. We have medical staff on hand, experienced guides, and you can find more information at synthesisretreat.com. That is synthesisretreat.com, and yeah, you can check out all the information about that.
And we just had an excellent retreat about 2 weeks ago, our first one, and it went really well. So yeah, that was
really still feeling the afterglow of that one.
Sure.
So my last question would be, can microdosing heal trauma, or does it just uplift our mood? You talked to a few experts, so I would love to hear what they said as well.
Well, and I think this kind of goes back into what we spoke about with the last point. And this even goes into the article that was just published on High Existence yesterday about how we're discovering psychedelics as a thing for depression. Is with psychedelics, they activate something called the 5-HT2A receptor, which is tied to active coping, meaning instead of just blunting our emotional response to trauma that we've had in the past, the trauma starts to come up, and we have to start to look at it and integrate it in a way that helps us to become a more healthy self. And this is different than typical antidepressants, which activate something called the 5-HT2A. I think it's the 5-HT1A receptor. Yeah. 5-HT1A receptor is those are passive coping, meaning they blunt our emotional response to the issue, whatever it is. So, we feel better, but we never actually face our shit, so to say. Mm-hmm. And so microdosing, because it's a low dose of a psychedelic, I like to use a metaphor when talking about this that I got from a friend of mine, Neil Goldsmith. A high dose of a psychedelic is like someone's yelling at you and shaking you to kind of get the message, right? To face that shadow side, to see those dark secrets that we have that are tied to trauma and issues. And that can be very jarring and very overwhelming. Whereas a microdose is more like a whisper. It's like, this is it, this is it, this is it. And that's easier to integrate then over the long term. So I think that for me encapsulates how microdosing can be useful. But I think it's only if, again, microdosing is used in combination with journaling, meditation, other things that help us to cultivate those higher levels of self-awareness. And this is, of course, what we talk about so much in our microdosing course that Martijn and I have collaborated on putting together. Martijn was instrumental in helping us to really lay the foundation for that, as well as Charlie, who's in the chat room with all of you, but not on video. Us three spent probably hundreds of hours putting together a comprehensive microdosing course where we go into these exact topics, where we talk about really the intersection of microdosing and optimization, and how you can make sure that if you're going out on a limb to microdose, whether that's legally or whether that's just from a personal perspective, that you can make sure that you get the most out of it. And I think this is a really important angle, is a lot of people are just coming to microdosing and being like, I'll just take a microdose here and there. They're not really sure if it'll have any effect. Mm-hmm. If you're going to do this, you should do it well, because if it's done well, and Martijn and I can speak to this, Charlie can speak to this, the many kind of hundreds of people in our current microdosing course can speak to this. If it's done well, it has the potential to be profoundly transformative and helpful. Mm-hmm. And so what we're doing then in the webinar, we're not going to open this up yet, but in a few minutes after we do a little bit of Q&A, we're going to open up the microdosing course, and we have, I believe, a discount for everyone who's attending the webinar today, if that's something that you'd like to purchase and get access to so that you can begin your microdosing protocol. And in the course, you not only have videos, expert interviews with psychiatrists, psychotherapists, peak performance experts, but you also get access to a community of 800 other microdosers from around the world you can then talk to about best ways and strategies to get the most out of microdosing based on why you're doing it. So we'll open that up in a little bit. What we want to do first, and Martijn, anything to add to that from the course? Because
I do want to add to that, because we created like this very specific workbook that helps you track on like, why are you microdosing? Where do you want to aim your consciousness? Where do you want to grow? Where do you want to focus on? Especially with psychedelics, intention setting is so important. And so what I try to do is, like, I see microdosing as a catalyst that really amplifies all these elements. And you can use it to go on a party, which I personally love. But if you use it intentionally to enhance your, for example, your yoga or your social relationships, then you get so much more out of it. So what I learned with High Existence, like how people actually structure their thoughts, their beliefs, I put it all in the workbook. And I think that's a great personal development tool in itself. But if you added microdose to it, you will see amazing results. And I worked really hard with Paul and with Charlie to really make this the best way to intentionally use psychedelics. And I agree with Paul. I think after cannabis, microdosing will be next, but only if it's done well, and only if people get results, use it well, and then speak about it. So check it out. I would highly recommend using this as a practice in your life.
Great. Yeah, that's a great add-on. So let's do a few questions. And then once we do a few questions, we're going to open up the offer as well. And like we said, we have a discount code for High Existence if this is something you want access to. So Martijn, do you want to lead with the questions?
Sure. I think the first one we haven't talked about is like, can you talk about microdosing, how it impacts someone with red-green color blindness?
Yeah, so this is what kind of Jim Fadiman came to a conclusion to in his first research, was that microdosing is best for people or not, like people who have red-green color blindness should not microdose, basically, because it can create issues. So if you have color blindness, microdosing is not for you. And that's just kind of like a basic thing. There's really not much to add to that. And it just, I think, creates confusion and can cause like other issues if you're colorblind and microdosing.
Do you happen to know any theories or explanations about that, or is it like completely?
I don't remember offhand, but I just know that people who were microdosing and who were colorblind were reporting some like issues.
Right. And we talked about that. I would love for you to mention that it works with things like social anxiety, right? But not in general anxiety.
General anxiety is hit or miss. It's like if you're anxious, probably a high dose of a psychedelic and an optimized setting is a good first way to start. So you can explore the root of your anxiety. Right. Some people found that it worsens their anxiety. Some people found that it helps. So it's kind of like a hit or miss, but it's not like for depression, where generally it seems to be very helpful for people with depression because of its antidepressant effects.
Right. Is this also something you guys do research on? Because I know the Third Wave just started with the microdosing course, and the participants actually do research, right?
Right. And so that's the next transition. Is we are in the process of becoming a nonprofit, and then utilizing the revenue that we generate, which I think is an important aspect as well. Everything is mission driven to change the cultural conversation around psychedelics through the topic of microdosing. So anyone who invests in any of the things that we've developed is, they're basically putting their money directly towards a psychedelic education and psychedelic research on microdosing. So that is something that we're starting to roll out, that by the end of 2018, we'll probably have our first study published on microdosing.
I'm so excited to discover more about this.
Exciting.
Yeah. So the next one is from Mariam. Can you successfully microdose on an antidepressant?
So I won't go too much into detail with that. Charlie, could you provide the link for the Microdosing Psychedelics website that has the list of medications that are okay to take while microdosing? Jim and Charlie will put that up there. Jim Fadiman put together a full list, and his co-researcher, Sophia Korb, put together a full list of medications that are okay to microdose with. So if you're on certain antidepressants, I believe they're on that list, it's safe to microdose with according to that list. But of course, if you are on any sort of pharmaceuticals, it's always best to first check with your doctor before going that route. And although we haven't fleshed this out yet, what we will be offering in the near future is access to ideally psychiatrists and other people who have extensive experience with these things, so that they can provide better advice, because a lot of doctors don't have any education about psychedelics to begin with. So it's hard to get, a clear understanding of what's okay and what's not.
Yeah, and some antidepressants you can taper off, some you can't, and it's very, very unique per person, per substance. So don't do this on your own. Like, talk to your doctor, tell them about your plans, and maybe send them some more information, and make sure you get supervision on this. It's very important. Personally,
No, I would say let's do a couple more questions. But what I want to do is, just because we're nearing the hour mark, I want to open up the offer so that people, if they want access to the microdosing course at a discount, they can do that. And I'm going to publish that now. And Charlie is going to post the code that you can put into the website to get our discount. I believe Charlie's at 20% off, or is it $20 off?
I think it's $20 from what I remember.
Okay. So it's not 20%. That's a mistake that I wrote in there. $20 off our microdosing course. Normally it's $147. If you use the coupon, which Charlie will put in, it's High Existence 20, High Existence 20. You'll get $20 off our course today. And if you need time to make a decision, I believe that's okay, but it will just go back up to normal price after a certain period of time. So if you want access to the discount, it's best to act on that offer as soon as possible. And I think that then the course goes into, for example, I know we've seen a couple questions now about sourcing and the legal aspects and implications of sourcing. And so this is not why we provide the community, but it definitely helps the community that we provide in the microdosing corps, helps people to connect with others, where there's not necessarily a sense of, I'm going to source my psychedelics from this other person, but there are conversations that can be had around, okay, I was struggling with this same problem. I couldn't source. This is how I overcame that problem. Some people go to the dark web, which is illegal still. Some people, for example, order from the Netherlands, where you can order truffles if you're in the EU or the UK. There are a lot of people who order from Canada, and they order psychedelic analogs called 1P-LSD and 4-ACO DMT. And we include extensive details on all of that, on those substances in our course. And then in our community, a lot of people have experience with sourcing themselves in terms of the different obstacles they overcame to get what they needed. So we can't provide any direct help or even really explicit advice on how to do that, just because of the legal implications. But that's why we've created a community of microdosers, is so that some of these obstacles can be overcome through kind of the hive mind process.
There's a question by Simon. Does the right dose depend on body weight, or is it purely individual?
Great question. So it is individual, largely. I mean, this is the challenge with psychedelics, is everyone's going to be different. And so that's why we didn't talk a lot about this today, but we really go into depth in this in the course, is calibration. How do you calibrate your dose level so it's not too high, because that's not a microdose anymore. Then you just get giggly, you kind of lose, but it's not too low, so that way you don't have any effect. And this is part of the optimization process, is how do you calibrate that dose level, whether it's LSD, whether it's magic mushrooms, whether it's potentially some of these other analogs that are used. We go really into depth in that on the course in terms of calibrating your dose level appropriately.
Great, thank you. There's one last question here by John. Is there a difference in microdosing mushrooms versus LSD?
Great question. So LSD and mushrooms are obviously different substances, but they do have a lot of similarities. So from a difference perspective, LSD is a lot more energetic. It's more active on the dopaminergic system. And so it lasts about twice as long. So mushrooms last about 6 hours, whereas LSD lasts about 12 hours. So I always say, if you struggle with insomnia, it's probably better not to microdose LSD, to go with microdosing mushrooms, and to make sure that you always do it in the morning. The other main difference that I've noticed, and I've had this kind of validated by a number of other people, is LSD tends to be more of a cognitive enhancer. So it helps with creative projects. It helps with social extroversion quite a bit. So it helps going external. And I found mushrooms to be a much more internal thing. So they help with really doing inner work, self-reflection, self-understanding, feeling-oriented, emotional work, rather than sort of cognitive doing work. So those are the main differences that we notice, that I've noticed personally, and that we've noticed in the things that the reports that we've collected.
Great. Well, Paul, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for offering our audience $20 discount. It's very generous of you. I really hope people find a lot of value in your continuous work to normalize and bring these substances in a way to be like in a safe, science-based, empirical, evidence-based way to the people who probably can use them to hopefully deal with their issues and find ways to get enhancement in their lives. So
absolutely. And thank you for hosting this, and thank you for all the work that you've done with microdosing. Obviously, like I mentioned, your initial article was very inspirational in my own work, and it really helped to push forward the narrative so that we could build something like the third wave, which I think is it's coming at an incredibly important time, is we really need to look at how we can legitimize these substances. And I think the key after clinical research is psychedelic literacy and education. I think getting people to engage with a topic like microdosing, which is much more approachable than high doses of psychedelics, is incredibly important. And so that's why we offer the microdosing course, is so that we can generate revenue to support our mission, so that we can continue to carry out what we need to do to make this dream a reality, basically. So, and I also want to thank your whole audience for coming, for attending the webinar, for making this happen. It's been a lot of fun, and I can't wait to do the next one. We should do these conversations more often.
This was fun. This is also my first webinar, and I really enjoyed it. So thanks.
Absolutely. And if you guys have any other questions, I see there's a couple more questions popping up. We likely answer that in the microdosing course, but also feel free to send us an email. But it's about the hour mark now, and we want to be respectful of your time. So thank you so much, all of you, for attending, for showing up, for coming. And Charlie might hang out in the question and answer box a little bit longer, but we're going to cut the video feed now. We'll keep the offer up, $20 off if you want access to our microdosing course. And I hope you all have a lovely, beautiful rest of your weekend.
Bye, guys. There you go.